Welcome. Welcome to Interfaith Power and Light's webinar conversation with the filmmaker of Current Revolution, this year's featured film of Faith Climate Action Week. Also joining us today will be the Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley, IPL Board Chair Emeritus, and our moderator today will be Reverend Susan Hendershot, IPL President. As you join, introduce yourself to all the panelists and attendees by dropping in the chat your name, your state affiliate if you know it, or your congregational affiliation and your location. And for those of you just now joining us, welcome. This is IPL's conversation with the filmmaker of Current Revolution, this year's featured film of Faith Climate Action Week. As you join, introduce yourself to all the panelists and to the other attendees by dropping your name in the chat, along with your congregational affiliation and your location. As you have questions today for our panelists, please use the Q&A feature that's at the bottom of your screen there. If you're not familiar with the Q&A feature, it's right just to the right of center along the bottom there, Q&A. And before we begin today, we like to acknowledge that the land that we reside on as Indigenous land is one way that we seek to orient ourselves in this work and do the justice of this work. I invite you to place in the chat the name of the people whose land you rely upon now. If you don't know, this is an invitation to learn. So we'll be dropping in the chat the name of a website where you can look up what the name of your native land is. And you can watch the recording of today's webinar on IPL's YouTube and Facebook page and share it with your friends. So again, use the Q&A feature for your questions for the panelists, and that's found at the bottom of your screen. And I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Sarah Paulos. I'm the Community Outreach and Program Director for Interfaith Power and Light. IPL's mission is to inspire people of faith and conscience to take bold and just action on climate change. Faith Climate Action Week is IPL's premier week to build that movement of faith climate action, when thousands of congregations across the country focus on preaching, teaching, and acting to heal the climate. This year's Faith Climate Action Week featured film is a series of 3 short films called Current Revolution, made by the award-winning filmmaker Roger Sorkin with the American Resilience Project. These films illustrate this year's Faith Climate Action Week theme, Living the Golden Rule, a just transition to a clean energy economy. The theme examines our responsibility to transition to energy sources that are sustainable and healthy for our communities and our sacred earth. The first of the 3 films shows the benefits of transitioning to renewable energy. The second one shows the importance of prioritizing frontline communities and displaced fossil fuel workers in the transition, illustrated with a story about a Navajo community in New Mexico. And the third is an inspiring example of how a just transition is already happening in the story about a successful EV charging station maintenance company started by 2 women of color. And if you haven't yet viewed the films or hosted a screening for your congregation, sign up at the link in the chat. You can still host a screening through April 23rd. Now, IPL President Reverend Susan Hendershot will moderate today's conversation. I'll turn it over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. So happy to have all of you with us today for this wonderful conversation during our Faith Climate Action Week. It's always thrilling to be able to speak with the filmmaker whose film we are featuring. And of course, our own Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley, who appears in one of the films as well. So I want to just take a moment to introduce our 2 speakers to you, and then we'll get started with our conversation. So the Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley serves as the IPL Board Chair Emeritus, and he is the former pastor of the historic Providence Missionary Baptist Church of Atlanta, where he served for nearly 25 years. Reverend Durley's previous roles include Executive Director of the Head Start program for Fulton and Douglas counties, Director of the Health Promotion Resource Center at the Morehouse School of Medicine, and founder of Perspectives International, a consortium of historically Black colleges and universities. In 2011, Reverend Durley was inducted into the International Civil Rights Walk of Fame for his contributions during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So Gerald, of course, it's always a pleasure to be with you. Glad to have you here today. And Roger Sorkin, founder and filmmaker with the American Resilience Project. Roger is an award-winning producer, writer, editor, and director of mission-driven films designed to strengthen civilizational security. Prior to founding ARP, Roger consulted with and created documentary and dramatic films for a wide range of nonprofit, academic, and government institutions, including the U.S. Global Leadership Campaign, the USAID, NATO, and the American Cancer Society. He has taught energy and environmental communication at the Fordham University Gabelli School of Business. And after graduating with a degree in anthropology from the Johns Hopkins University in 1993, Roger worked as a public radio journalist and producer, and then received a Master of Communication from Stanford University with a focus in documentary film. So Roger, welcome to you. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you, Susan.
So, Reverend Durley, I'm gonna throw the first question to you, and that is that our theme for Faith Climate Action Week this year is living the golden rule. And you have long been speaking out about the relationship between environmental justice and civil rights. What does it mean to you to live the golden rule with regard to a just transition for fossil fuel workers to a clean energy economy?
Thank you, President Susan Hindisha. I'm so honored to be on the phone on this webinar with all the people across the nation and the great work that you're doing with the Interfaith Power and Light organization, and to be with my friend Roger Sorkin. And it shows that over the years that you've worked when you were in Minnesota and other places, and Roger, all these years, that finally and at last, the mitigation of climate change has reached another level. When we all got into this, people looked at us as we were somewhat askance. I never thought that I would be on a call with so many distinguished people today in the conservation movement, because my life and everything had been around civil and human rights. There with Dr. King and Andy and John and all of us. But as years go on, and I've learned over the last decade that there's very little difference between what we're doing today in the environmental movement and what we did in the civil rights movement. Because we're in an ethical and a moral war right now, where we're raising the issue that everybody has a right to clean energy and clean water, toxic-free air. That's a constitutional right. So we all have to be excited about that. So I've seen over the last several years where I'm merging both of those particular movements together. And as we learn in the text, all religions, all faiths say that we are our brother and our sister's keeper. We've got to be concerned about one another's mental, physical, and spiritual well-being. And in order to do that, we've got to really care. The golden rule, caring about our neighbors. And I think that that's why it's so important, because we were all given a perfectly balanced ecological world, given to us to share and given to us to work. So now we've got to come together, because we've gone into a lot of little silos, if you will, and we all have our own little individual spot. But when we all come together, then we begin to look out for each other. And when we begin to look out for each other, we have formed a movement. We used to say in the civil rights movement, we've got to organize, strategize, and then mobilize. And right now, the work that you're doing and Roger's doing, we're organizing and we're putting our strategies together on this phone, everybody on this call today. And then we're going to mobilize. We're going to walk out and make a difference, because we've got to care about our neighbors. And it says, who is your neighbor? The one who you reached over and helped. And we're about that business. So that's why I'm excited about the theme for this year and why we must do it. I think that the environmental movement also ties into the great anti-crime movement, because when we can get an environment that is conducive to well-being and well-living, it reduces the level of even the anxiety that creates crime. So it's all interrelated. And that's why I'm just so pleased to be here.
Thank you so much. That was a great opening statement. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Roger, because I'm sure folks are really curious, first of all, what made you decide to make this film series, but maybe start by telling us a little about the American Resilience Project itself, and then what made you decide to do this particular film series.
Thank you, Susan. It's great to be with you all. So the organization is called the American Resilience Project, and we make mission-driven films. We start with what is the change we would like to see in the world, whether that's through public policy or investment or behavioral change. And then we work backwards towards making the film that we think is going to have the most effect to support the advocacy efforts that we're all pushing for. I believe that if we can't tell a good story about what we're doing and why we're doing it, we're not going to get it done. So I'm biased, but I think that narrative is really the foundation for all movements and all progress. I mean, as a harmonious society, or one that aspires to be harmonious, if we can't sing off the same script and we can't understand what the same values are and see ourselves in the story, I think that's really critical. That's something that I try to do with the films is allow viewers to see how these stories affect them, to make them less abstract. A lot of climate filmmaking and environmental filmmaking has been abstract issues. Sometimes it's hard to get your mind around. It's hard to understand why this affects me. If we're just hearing that the sea level is rising and the polar ice caps are melting, it doesn't still connect with people in their daily lives. I mean, yes, many of us who pay attention to this can connect the dots, but I think the lowest common denominator is a good story that already comes with the dots connected, where people can see how these stories relate to their own basic human needs. And that's really what I think about when I make these films. I'm thinking about the basic human needs of the audience. And we try to reach audiences across the political spectrum, not pander to people, but try to transcend some of these political frames that are a bit stale and a little too one-dimensional for really the purposes of achieving the progress that we need to achieve. So rather than say, save the earth, how about save your neighborhood? If we can save every neighborhood, then we don't necessarily, the earth, I think, or it's going to take care of itself. It'll get rid of us if it needs to, so it'll be all right. But I think we as human beings, we need to understand that we do have self-interest, as altruistic as we may be, and our self-interest begins with taking care of our families, our homes, our livelihoods, maintaining hope for the future. So I think those are the core pillars for every story that I try to tell. Why an organization to do it in the way that we do it? It's a nonprofit, which is unusual. There are a lot of film production companies, but because we start with the mission and we start with the change that we want to see, it made sense to create a nonprofit. It allows us to operate in ways that I think a for-profit entity couldn't. It certainly makes us eligible for grants that we wouldn't be eligible for if we were a business, or a for-profit business, that is. So I started doing this work really simply in response to frustration that I had with climate and environmental filmmaking that people made beautiful films. People have always been making beautiful films, but for those filmmakers who set out to change the world through their work and could consider themselves activists also, I feel like they need to get that activist equation and formula right first before they start making the film. And that's what I aspire to do. I'll let others decide if I'm doing a good job of it, but that's really front and center for our work.
That's really wonderful to hear. And, I think especially what resonates from the position of being a faith-based organization is really focusing on values. I think that has been something that Interfaith Power and Light and many of our faith-based colleagues have tried to focus on in our conversations with folks around the issues of climate change in particular. And I love the whole standpoint of storytelling as well, because I think we can agree that, one more bar graph probably isn't going to change someone's mind, but a good story that really speaks to the heart is something that definitely can bridge that divide oftentimes. And so I'm curious to know what role you believe your films play in the just transition to a clean energy economy. We're talking about this particular Current Revolution series that our folks have been viewing. What played into that for you in terms of how you saw your role as a filmmaker in helping that transition take place?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that about bar graphs. I often will cite bar graphs and pie charts as not the way to create a memorable emotional connection with a viewer or a consumer of that white paper, for example. It's funny because I sometimes think of our films as white papers disguised as films, because we're trying to illuminate a policy roadmap or a roadmap for change that, you have to understand policymakers, as intelligent as many of them are, and we know not all of them are that intelligent, but they're busy people and they have a lot of information coming at them all the time. And so to put things in a bullet point or an executive summary is really critical for policymakers to understand the meat of an issue, be able to go out and either vote on it or talk about it. And I think the medium of film, because it can connect on that emotional level, and the medium of story, I don't know that there's any empirical data on this, but I suspect there might be, that we remember things better when we have an emotional experience with it, as opposed to just a cerebral experience. And so I think to your question about the energy transition and just energy transitions, first and foremost, this is a story about people. It's not a story about types of energy. It's not a story about the earth and the energy that it provides for us. I mean, those are all bit players in the story, but it's really, the just transition is a transition for people. And so I want to make sure that we don't leave people behind, that when we're talking about making these wholesale changes and imposing technical fixes and technical solutions on what are much more than just technical problems. There's a social problems, cultural, behavioral, and it's easy to lose sight of the people that can slip through the cracks. It's easy for environmentalists, environmental policymakers from Washington, D.C. to go out to coal mines in West Virginia and just say, hey, don't worry about your job. We're just going to retrain you all to become computer programmers. That goes in with a bit of arrogance, not understanding the fact that not every 59-year-old miner is going to feel that that's something they can do, that they want to do, doesn't respect the hard work that they've put in for decades and the physical pains that they may have suffered from a very challenging and physically demanding job. So I think we need to understand the entire human and labor experience before we can just start making these wholesale changes and really abruptly uprooting people from the status quo, right? We know that we need change, but change is hard and we need to be delicate about it. And we need to understand that human dignity is a part of it. Pride is a part of it. And when we go in without a respect for the people that are at the forefront of this change, it can only backfire. So what I'm trying to do with these films is show that, this is a story about workers. We've got to think about them first and make sure they are going to land well before we start going and knocking down all the smokestacks.
That's really beautifully said. And I have to say, this is a topic that's very close to my own heart because I grew up in a blue collar family that, my grandfather worked in the steel mills. My father worked in a foundry. And, many times we know the decisions are not made with workers in mind. And so I want to turn back to Reverend Durley for a moment because, I think this really also is close to the heart of the conversation around environmental justice and frontline communities. And the question is, who needs to be at the table? And in fact, who needs to be setting the table when we're addressing the problems and opportunities associated with the decline of fossil fuels and the rise of renewables? So from your perspective, Reverend Durley, who has been historically left out of these conversations and who needs to be setting the table in these discussions?
Generally, those that are left out of the table are those that suffer the most. They don't have the political clout, they don't have the economic abilities to be there, so they're left out of the conversation. But what I wanted to respond to Roger, and I'll come back to where you're talking, Susan, and that is, we live in an age of social media. It puts out a lot of misinformation, it puts out a lot of things that excite the people, and so the film itself, Current Revolution. And Roger, let me thank you for calling it revolution. I had to look up the word revolution. I thought I was a revolutionist at one time, militant, whatever. But a revolution is defined as a radical change in the established order, usually the established government and social institutions, a sudden, radical, complete change. And I think that that's what, when you named it a current revolution, it's something that's to shock us. If we're to really have the kind of impact that so many people are talking about, it's got to get down to the gut, to the storytelling where people can actually feel it. And what your film has done, I think, Roger, is that the actual information, we've had all the information as Susan talked about, the pie charts and the statistics, they meant nothing to me. I could have cared no less whether a polar bear got to another glacier or what happened to the trees. It was not in my area. And I think most people who are trying to survive, it's not there. But what you've done is you've taken all this information, and this information we have, it was a major flood in our minds on our TV sets. And as long as it's just information, that's just like a flood coming into our community. But when you take that information and put it into a film or put it into a certain area, that's like irrigation, and it channels it. So what you're doing now and what we're trying to do even through IPL is channel all that information so that rather than it destroying fields, it's bringing forth crops and new ideas. When I looked at what happened, the toxic waste that has been placed in the African-American community, when I look at places like down in South Carolina, Death Row, where the petrol companies are filling up the waterways, and we have cancer at an alarming rate, asthma at an alarming rate. These are individuals that need to be at the table. But it's an interesting thing about our society. You can be at the table if you bring a certain amount of dollars to the table, if you bring a certain amount of leverage to the table. But we've got to understand that people that maybe not have the same economic level, or the same education level, that they bring another perspective as to what is actually going on in that area. And when we pull those two things together, I think we have an opportunity to mitigate the climate change and first of all, bring a level of insensitivity. And I think that that's key. I think that's what this webinar is about, and those on the call, to bring a new level of sensitivity so that we can channel our energies in a collective way, in a collaborative way with those who are not at the table. A lot of times those people who are not at the table, they don't even know that there's a table. You're kept in the dark like mushrooms. Mushrooms, they keep them in the dark and throw a little fertilizer in every now and then. Mushrooms go in the dark, and we got to get people out of the dark into an enlightened area. Dr. King says that the civil rights movement was the consciousness of America. I contend that the environmental movement now is the consciousness of America. The environmental movement, because it crosses all dimensions of our society. So if we're crossing all dimensions of our society and all the ships rise together, then those individuals who are experiencing the loss, the hurricanes, the floods, the heat wave, the food deserts, the diseases, all of those things are right in the heart of many of the poor rural areas as well, where we see what's going on in North Carolina, where they're polluting the streams, and it's negatively, disproportionately impacting those. So those are the individuals that need to sit down, be at the table to share the information. And when you begin to share the information with those who have the ability to make a change, then I think we're really going to start making a major difference in this nation.
Amen. And yeah, and thank you for sharing that larger perspective, Reverend Durley. I really appreciate that. And I'm sure both of you are very well aware of the U.S. government's Justice 40 initiative, where for the first time in our nation's history, the federal government has made it a goal that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments will flow to disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. And Roger, I want to go back to you. I'm curious to know how you see some of the projects highlighted in your films fitting into the Justice 40 initiative, or I guess if you do, and in what ways. And one thing I'm thinking of in particular is an update on, for example, the Navajo renewable energy project.
Yeah, I mean, I think, all of these stories are really, I try to tell the stories of frontline communities. They're the ones that are experiencing the most abrupt change. And, then when the Navajo story came to my attention, it just so happened that the Navajo generating station was being knocked down during the time that we were actually filming the story. You don't get lucky like that every time you set out to make a film where big giants, visually exciting event is going to take place while you have your cameras around. But I feel like you cannot tell the energy transition story without going to disadvantaged communities, because that's where the story is. I mean, it's where the most sacrifice occurs. And so I feel like that's sort of baked into the script of all of these stories. So I hope that answers your question. I never really thought of it in any other terms. I mean, I think I'm not entirely familiar with the criteria for the Justice 40 program, but I would suspect that all of the people who have appeared in our films are eligible for some support there. One of the gentlemen that we interviewed in the Navajo Nation, he talked about the Salt River Project, the company. I think many of you saw this in the film. We're not trying to demonize industry. We're also not trying to just give them a pass and compliment them. We're trying to just show the good news where it is. And in that particular case, you have an example of a power company that had been somewhat intransigent over the years to change, finally understanding that, well, this is the direction this is heading. We've got to do this, making sure that all of their employees would have jobs when the plant closed, and they followed through with that. And so I felt that it was important to give them credit in the film, at least to set an example for other companies that might be experiencing the same sort of change, so they can see, for whatever reasons, whether they've experienced lots of bad public relations over the years, which a lot of power companies have, by their own doing in many cases, they can see a pathway to actually improving their public relations, and more importantly, just doing the right thing and understanding that they can still make money if you can do well by doing good, as they say. So I think, I'm not as familiar with the Justice 40 in detail, but I really do think that, if we're not telling the stories of frontline communities, then we're kind of wasting our time.
Well, I think that I was really drawn to the story of the Navajo Nation, partly because we have an affiliate in New Mexico, and of course they've been working hard on many issues taking place around fossil fuels in New Mexico. But I think it was a great example of bringing all the parties to the table, like we were talking about earlier, of saying we need to understand what the workers need. We need to understand what the community needs. We also, they needed to understand the power needs that were a part of that particular generating plant as well. And it seemed like an example where multiple parties were involved in decision making with a very positive outcome for everyone, where workers were assured of jobs. I remember one worker that you interviewed in the film who said, if he hadn't been able to get that next job, there wouldn't have been anything else for him, because there were no other jobs really in the community. So it's just a very striking example to me of how including everyone in decision making can really lead to a very positive outcome in this particular case.
If I could just say one thing also about that. I mean, the jury is still out. No transition has been completed. I mean, there's still a lot of follow through that needs to be done. So we need to be very mindful of the fact that even though they've done some good things to date, there's still a lot they've promised that hasn't yet come to materialize, and it's not necessarily their fault. And I'm not as steeped in the day-to-day realities to know if they're moving as fast as they can, and to separate out what is lip service from actual real commitment. And I certainly can't speak on behalf of the Navajo Nation, but I should say that we issued our praise and compliments of Salt River Project for doing some good work at that time. But we can't let up, and we can't take our attention away from them because there's still a lot of follow through that needs to happen.
Great, thanks for.
Yes, I like to add to that. It's not just coming to the table. I've sat at tables for 40 years. I've sat at tables around voting rights. This time, I think what happens, Susan, what we've got to look at is that what happens when you're at the table. A lot of times you can sit at the table and you're somewhat taciturn, kind of quiet, and they're talking all around you and you don't know what's really going on. So I think the real breakdown, if we're to break through, is a word that we've all used on this call and other calls, is the ability to communicate. Now, there are three primary principles. If we're to really do what we want to do around climate change and somebody sitting at the table, we've got to communicate, and that's predicated upon three primary principles. If I'm to communicate with you, I've got to understand what you're saying. You've got to understand me. We've got to understand our background. I've got to understand that you have a corporate business. I've got to understand my community is important. So in order for me to communicate, I've got to understand you. And in order for me to understand you, then at the table, we're understanding each other. Second, I've got to respect you. A lot of times you sit at the table and there's very little respect even at the table. So consequently, if I understand you, then I can respect, and I can respect our differences. And then the third one is the toughest part of communicating when you're sitting at the table. Do you understand me? Do you respect me? And do you trust me? Can I trust you? Trust has broken down because we see the overall effects. So hopefully when we're at the table, that we do get an understanding. Once we develop that understanding, then I can respect, I know where you are. I realize that you've got people that are on your company, trustee holders of your financial people, and they've got to make a profit. As Roger said, I think earlier, you can make a profit in a different way as we go toward alternative energy. But I've got to understand you, I've got to respect you, and then I've got to trust you. Once I trust you, then we can sit down, then we've got a meaningful seat at the table rather than just another meeting. I'm about through with meetings and sitting at tables anymore. Unless you understand what I'm talking about, you respect me, and then we trust, then we work together as a collaborative, and we can make a difference.
And if I could say something, I'm so glad you brought that up, Dr. Durley, because trust, I think that is a really critical part about how we make these films, where we're not just looking at important issues, but we're really starting with trusted messengers. And if you don't trust the messenger, you don't care what they have to say. You know, I use Al Gore as an example of someone who had really good intentions, made a very effective documentary film, An Inconvenient Truth, but it had a ceiling of how many people it could reach simply because of the fact that he was a political figure, and it's not his fault necessarily that people who disagree with his politics don't trust him. Sadly, that's where we are in this country. And so I try to make sure that the audiences that we're trying to reach are listening to trusted messengers in the film. You notice there's a lot of people in Nation in Transition who are Navajo, talking about their own personal experiences. It's to have a voiceover narrator, some famous actor to be the narrator, say the Navajo people think this and that. You're never going to get the buy-in of a community. People, no matter who they are, they need to see themselves reflected in the story to be able to, if we're making a film that's designed to influence investors at a Fortune 500 company, then we'll probably put a couple of Fortune 500 executives in the film because those are the messengers that would be trusted. So I think trust is absolutely critical. Otherwise, your message just falls flat.
And I do think that this is a place where the faith community can play a really important role, and does play a really important role, is coming into the conversation from the standpoint of our faith and our values. We often can reach people who might not otherwise be reached by sort of the traditional environmentalists, for example, or others. And so I want to turn this question back to you, Reverend Durley, which is, what do you think our faiths or spiritual traditions say about our responsibility towards fossil fuel workers and frontline community members who are at risk of being left behind?
I think one of our primary responsibilities of the faith communities, regardless of the issue, is to inspire hope in a people, in a hopeless situation, to inspire people to believe that we can make a difference. If the environmental movement is to take on the kind of strength and power and transformative faith that we believe, people have to believe in it and they have to have hope. So our major role, we sell hope every Sunday or every Saturday, or whether it's at the Shabbat service or whether it's at the prayer on Friday, the Juma prayers. We sell them a sense of hope in the midst of crime, in the midst of hope, in the midst of disparities in health. So now we've got to sell the message of hope around the environment. And God says this in Genesis 1:27, this is my earth I created for you. Don't treat it like a rental car. This is where I place you. And so, but we're seeing the other side where devastation, how do you give hope to a person who's sitting in the middle in their home and all their memories have been washed away by either a flood or by a hurricane? So we take that devastation that they're feeling at that time in the faith community, meaning hope, things that we don't see, the substance of things we hope for and the evidence of things not seen, and give them the hope in the middle of their pictures of the family being on the ground. They made it because they stayed in a bathtub or a closet, and we give them hope. Now take that same hope that we can share from the faith community and say, now, how do we address the legislative part of this? How do we address the economic part of this? How do we come and they hear, as we said, our story about this? But if they don't have hope, then I would prefer to face a person who is really just evil and mean and angry rather than someone with no hope. Because when you got a person with no hope, they don't know what it is that they're doing. That's the role, I think, of the faith community, to give that hope and then channel that hope so that we irrigate rather than we become a flood in people's lives. So I think our major role, and here's what's interesting, what I found, and I'm sure you have too, as you're up in Washington so many times, politicians are looking for that hope as well, because they live out here with us as well. They're going through the same kinds of efforts that we're going through. So if we can give them that modicum of hope, so when the business people and others come, they can have a hope that if I tell the truth, if I work hard, I won't lose my position. Many of them vote the wrong way because they want to keep that job. But if we can show them that they can, as Roger just said, do good and still provide for the welfare of other people. But if you don't have that hope, you just give up. That's our primary role at all levels, to give the politicians hope. Give the people in the business world, you can make a living. And they say, I can? My investors will get a return on their dollar? Yes. Then they got a hope. Then we all come together.
That's great. Yeah, we definitely believe in an active hope, not a passive, I hope everything works out for you, right? But an active hope that means that we have agency, that what we do actually matters. And so Roger, I want to turn to you on this question of hope. Do you see evidence of progress or reasons for hope that America will successfully transition to clean energy and address the pollution and social inequities inherent in our current energy system?
I do. I mean, I'm inherently hopeful. I think just when we break this down into real cause and effect, the more doom and gloom we push out, the less hopeful people are going to be. And I think with the messaging, we can't be naive about it, but we have to give people a bright path so that they feel that they can do something about it. Because when you tell people all the doom and gloom, they just, it's easy to just pull down the shutters and feel you can't, who am I, this one inconsequential person, how can I possibly do something? You gotta, like you said, about it having agency, you've got to remind people that we have agency, even if it's something as small as picking up the phone and calling your congressman. I mean, they sound so, in the way our political system is so skewed with money, and, we have media propaganda that's out there that does not serve us well. And, I won't mention any names of networks, but there's one I can think of that does not do the public service that it should be doing on our airwaves. So it's hard when you've got these information assaulting you all the time with lies and, feeling that you can actually do something about that. But members of Congress actually still take note of how many times their phone rings. If they get a lot of calls in one day, it gets their attention. I mean, granted, they're probably going out to dinner that night and getting a big check written to them by some fat cat, at a CEO or a hedge fund or whatever. But they're going to remember that when they voted in such a way on a certain bill that their phone lines lit up, that still gets their attention. So everybody still has agency. If you've got a phone, you've got agency, number one. As far as the other bits of hope, I mean, we just passed a few pieces of big legislation over the past 2 years that allocate a lot of money. So you've got money that's now flowing to communities all over the country to do microgrid projects and stormwater mitigation and all kinds of things that are going to make us a more resilient society, specifically with regards to the energy transition. There's a lot more energy flowing, a lot more money flowing for electric vehicle transformation, for example. So I have a lot of hope that maybe before those bills passed, I was a little less hopeful, but now the real problem is making sure that the money gets to the right people in the right amount of time, and they have the technical expertise to do the job. But the first big hurdle has been passed. So I think that there's a lot of hope. And I think also businesses are starting to recognize more and more that a fossil fuel-based economy is just not good for their business. And they realize that they got to get ahead of this. And, they might be clinging to those drilling licenses as much as they possibly can. But, they know at the end of the day that that is a finite source. The value of it is just going to go down, and they better get ahead of it. So I'm hopeful. Whether we can do it in the amount of time we need to do it, that remains to be seen. But if we're negative about it and pessimistic about it, that's only going to slow us down.
And I like to answer. I'll tell you where my hope rests in some of the young people that I see today. I was at Chattahoochee River. I see the excitement in the young people when the George Floyd situation occurred and Kerry Nichols. I saw so many young people across faith lines, across color lines out there talking about justice. And they've got a new level of excitement, and they communicate even better than we did because they can put out one little media blurb and reach 1,000. We would get on the mimeograph machine and run them off all day, get ink all over us, and maybe we'd reach 50 people to come. So they're using their intellectual, they're not only using their technological skill, but they believe in something strongly enough now. So my hope is that when I see young people now rallying around causes and going out there, I saw so many of them with the Roe versus Wade. And because we'd stopped taking it to the streets to a certain degree. But these young people, so that I find hope in that, along with, as Roger was talking about, the legislatures and organizations like IPL, but it's the young people that they're beginning to see it because it's in their face. And they're realizing it's not about the next generation. It's about their generation and what do they do now? And they're responding at all different elementary, junior, high school, and the college level, certainly. That gives me hope.
That's right. That's right. And I want to turn, we have a couple of sort of related questions from some of our audience members today. And they're sort of politically related to this issue that you brought up earlier around trust. And so one of our participants asked, and I'll start with you, Roger. What can be done to decrease political polarization that prevents people from accepting the benefits of clean energy, such as reduced air pollution and lower costs? So do you have suggestions for what folks can do?
I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I don't mean to be glib, but for one thing, we can make sure that Fox News pays the price for putting out lies about this stuff. That's number one. I think people can learn to talk with each other better. I mean, there's this, I've seen this trend over the years. I'm sure we all have, where people don't want to talk about politics. It's too touchy. It's too sensitive. I think we need to go double down on talking about politics, but importantly, we need to know how to talk about politics. So if you have a family member that you're always worried about, the wrong topic of conversation coming up at Thanksgiving dinner, don't avoid the conversation, but try to understand the world from that person's view for the point of view, and then talk to them on their terms, because I think there's a universal truth here that we can all work with. Again, we all want clean air. We all want to have a comfortable place to live. We all want the road in front of our house to not be flooded during high tide. So, you know, if we can put things in terms that we all can relate to, we can all understand, there's a way to build trust and have these conversations and really depolarize and depoliticize some of it. Our latest film, called Farm Free or Die, is designed to influence the upcoming US Farm Bill, and thinking about the legislators that we need to actually vote on that bill to prioritize regenerative agriculture. You know, they're the ones who are in red states often have a lot of farming communities. So it's a really nice combination there, where we're showcasing farmers who are experiencing hardship because of climate change, some of whom are not talking about it in terms of climate change. They're just talking about, my land is washing away because we keep getting these storms that are supposed to be 200-year storms, but they're coming every 2 years. So we're talking about it in those terms. We're avoiding the hot button talking point that you might see in, you know, on the editorial pages or on the punditry on cable news. But when you think about it in terms of everyone's daily life, everyone can relate to this. You know, you don't have to say climate change, but you can say, you know, what are we going to do about your topsoil? Okay, well, you need support from the government so that you can plant cover crops, so that you can have deeper root systems, so that the soil doesn't wash away when the 200-year storm comes along. Make it practical. Make it something that is tangible in someone's daily life. You know, you can talk about energy costs. You don't have to say, put solar panels on because it's going to save the earth. Say, put solar panels on because it's going to be cheaper and you're going to have a more predictable electric bill. Don't you want that? So, you know, for those of you who saw the first Current Revolution film, you have that community in Arizona. 63%, I think, or 65% are lined Republican. 30, 35 or whatever it was, is Democrat. Yet it's a community that has embraced solar power. And so they may be doing it for different reasons. Maybe they're not feeling sentimental about the future of the earth. Maybe they don't worry about climate change. They're worried about their electric bill. So if by getting them to worry about the electric bill is going to help you satisfy your priorities when it comes to saving the earth, then just talk about the electric bill. So I think it comes down to knowing your audience, knowing what their values are, trying to see the world. It's really emotional intelligence. It's trying to see the world through someone else's eyes. Even if you disagree with them, even if you don't want to inhabit that perspective very much or for very long, you're not going to make progress unless you can show the empathy towards that person and acknowledge that they have a legitimate perspective, at least as far as they're concerned, and then try to speak to them on their terms.
Yeah. Can I give a real example to how that works, what Roger just said?
Please.
Years and years ago throughout the South, they said cotton was king. And everybody was growing cotton and making a lot of money. And they were making money hand over fist growing cotton. But they began to find out that they could grow so much cotton, but then it was destroying the soil. So there was a small, thin black man named George Washington Carver at Tuskegee, came up with a novel idea called crop rotations. So he said, if you plant peanuts one year and cotton the next, the soil will have enough time to grow. And the farmer said, no, we got to make more money, more money. He said, no, they were scared. So finally, they started a thing called crop rotations. And by putting in crop rotation, it gave the soil a chance to grow. The cotton, they made money. Then they made money in off season on the peanut crop. So it showed that it can be done, but they had to show that they were still reaching their bottom line. But had they stayed the same thing growing cotton, it would destroy the whole agricultural economy in the South. So that's a practical way of when we talk about what's going on now with the environment, how do we begin to use another form of energy to still grow crops? I heard that the number one crop that's going to start being grown, I was watching on TV, will be rice. And the number one kind of, and geese are the number one fowl that's going to be used rather than beef. They're going toward ducks. I was watching on PBS. Because they, in Japan and China, where they grow crops, they get in the water in those rice fields and they're irrigating the ground by moving their legs. I never thought of that before. So it's a matter of how does it benefit the people so that there's a win-win situation? And I think we're moving closer to that.
Mhm. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. And another sort of question we have from several folks, I'm going to try to condense this into a question, but folks are wondering, I think, especially Roger, from you with regards to, you're the filmmaker, you're telling a story. What are some of the obstacles you think that viewers might find to receiving the message that you're trying to give, and how might those who are on this webinar in the audience who are guiding the discussion, they're looking for maybe a little sense of how they might guide the discussion better, in particular with regards to some of those obstacles to hearing the message that might pop up. Do you have any suggestions for folks?
I mean, I think the obstacle is really trying to break through so much information. It is, and it's an onslaught every single day. I mean, we all know we get alerts and we have social media streams, and it's just really hard to break through. And we, as an organization, we don't have anything near the might of a large network or a large web service. I mean, we have to go for qualitative audiences. That's really our strategy, is to understand who are the people that are voting on this, who are the people with the money, which shareholders, and then we really try to target those audiences. So, I think that's probably everybody's obstacle to a certain degree, is how do you break through the misinformation that's out there, and not just misinformation, but just the massive amount of information. It's really easy for a good news story to get buried within minutes. And it used to be, right, we used to have the morning paper, and then some of us would get the afternoon paper, and then that was the news cycle. And you could sit with a story and you could sit with information for a little while. And we all as a community had the time to gravitate towards particular narrative. There was a common, it was easier to get on board with a common narrative. Of course, granted, sometimes the common narrative wasn't the right one for everybody. But I think in this particular case, it's really just got to be sustained communication. And for those of you who are on social media, just make sure you're doing it all the time. I mean, I hate to say it because I don't like to be on social media. I wish we spent more time away from screens as a society. But the obstacle, as far as I can tell, is other information that I have to compete with to get our story out. So the more actual events, now that COVID is at least subsided to a point where we can get back out there in public, now is the time where we can have events and we can convene and bring people together. So whatever community you're in, I mean, creating films is a great convening tool. It's just a good way to get people in the same room. People like to go watch a movie. And then if you can get a high profile panel, or at least a panel that people want to hear from, then you maybe get some media exposure as a result. So if you can get your congressperson to show up for a screening at your congregation, and then you call your local paper, you've got people talking about the issue. You've got something they can hold on to and remember. They've had a real human experience with it. And it's not just like a tweet that flashes across your screen, but it's a memorable experience. I think that's really the way that we can push this narrative out there so that it becomes our common narrative.
That's great. That's great. And Roger, you alluded to your next film project, I believe. I wondered if you wanted to say any more about that, or give us the title again, and when can we see that?
Well, the latest completed film that's a longer length has been done for a little while, but we're just really ramping up the distribution for it, and we can use your help, everybody who wants to get involved on the issues of regenerative agriculture. I mean, I see all this stuff tying together: energy transition, food security. It's all under the banner of resilience. And I'm really just in this for stable society. At the end of the day, I want to know that when I wake up in the morning, that all of the systems that we've put in place as human beings are still going to be there. The lights are still going to work. The highways are still going to be safe, and public transportation is still going to be there, that our food's going to be able to be delivered. And so this particular film is called Farm Free or Die. It's on our website. You can watch it for free. The U.S. Farm Bill is coming up. It's going to be the next big battle in Congress. Hundreds of billions of dollars are going to be allocated for all sorts of things. And really what we need is for a lot of that money to prioritize regenerative agriculture so that farmers can still make a living, stay on their land, really become more resilient in the face of climate change, which is creating food instability for us. It's not just creating hardship for farmers, but we all see it when we go food shopping. Food prices are higher. So that's the next big battle, is making sure that we have food security for the foreseeable future, and really prioritizing regenerative agriculture as a way to get there. So we do have a couple of other films that we're working on in the Current Revolution series. But really, if there's any one call to action I'd like to leave you all with is think about the Farm Bill, start focusing on that. Because the last big policy fights really did address climate and energy in meaningful ways. So I wouldn't say, we can pat ourselves on the back and go home, but, now we got to make sure that money goes to the right people for sure. But right now, the next big policy fight is going to be over the Farm Bill.
That's great. And thanks for flagging that. Absolutely. Interfaith Power and Light is going to be taking an active role in working on Farm Bill legislation. So folks who are part of this webinar today, please be on the lookout for information from us that will be coming out throughout this year as we continue that work. And right now, our action for Faith Climate Action Week is focused on a company. And in fact, one of the biggest car makers in the world, Toyota. And the company has gone from being a leader when it comes to clean car technology, think of the Prius, to a laggard on building affordable electric vehicles. And that's why we're calling on Toyota to stop lobbying against climate change solutions and bring affordable all-electric vehicles to market. Toyota ranked among the world's most obstructive companies on climate policy of 2022, with oil giants like ExxonMobil and Chevron, which is just incredible. And right now, the transportation sector is the largest source of global warming pollution in the US, and frontline and low-income communities and communities of color bear the brunt of tailpipe pollution. We need to reduce these emissions and make clean cars affordable for all. So we did drop into the chat for you the petition to Toyota. Please help us gather signatures from your congregation's members using this link so that we can encourage Toyota to do better. We know that they can. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar and being part of this important conversation. As Sarah mentioned earlier, if you haven't yet viewed the film or hosted a screening for your congregation, you can still sign up at the link that's in the chat, and you can still host a screening through April 23rd. And you can watch the recording of today's webinar on IPL's YouTube channel and Facebook page and share it with your friends. And I, of course, want to thank you, Roger, for you and the American Resilience Project for your generous offer of free licensing to host a screening. We really appreciate that. We know the congregations are also appreciative of that. And I, of course, want to thank our two speakers today, Roger Sorkin and Reverend Gerald Durley. And Reverend Durley, I was hoping that you would just send us out with a blessing today as we leave our time together and take this out into the world. So I was hoping you would share a few just closing blessing remarks for us on the way out.
Oh boy, glad I was a Boy Scout. Boy Scouts motto: be prepared. Okay. Let me say this to all of you who are on this call today. This is our time. This is our moment. If not you, then who? If not now, then when do we do this? It is so absolutely essential. What I'd like to say to each person, what I find that keeps a movement not just started but going, is to be excited about what you're doing. Be enthusiastic about what you're doing. When I first got in the movement, I met a lot of very intelligent, a lot of committed people. They were in the conservation movement, and they'd be out and they talk, and they knew when the sun came up, when the sun went down, and all the statistics, but they weren't exciting. We live in a world where we're dealing with breaking news every 15 minutes. So we're in competition with that. So whatever your organization is, wherever you are, whoever the leaders are, be excited about when something comes out, like Susan talked about the Toyota piece. jump on it immediately, because it's only then when you're excited about something. In the church, in our tradition, we have a song called I'm on the Battlefield. And everybody gets up and they get to shouting, I'm on the battlefield for my Lord. But I've changed that. I said, don't sing I'm on the battlefield for me any longer. I don't need people on the battlefield anymore. I need some people in the battle. There's a difference between being in the battle and on the battlefield. I know people on the battlefield, but that's never been in the battle. So I say to each of us as we depart from this place, but never from the presence of our meeting and our coming together, let's get in the battle. Let's be enthusiastic. The word enthusiastic means in theos, in God. And if you're in God and you believe in it, then you ought to be excited. I'm excited just sitting here talking with you right now. I might just run out and plant a tree. I don't know, but get excited about something and it's catching. It's catching. As I think Roger, it's enough doom and gloom all around us all day. You be the exciting part. You be the catalyst. And I'm sure that we can mitigate climate change and we're going to make a difference. And I don't want you to bend. I don't want you to bow. I don't want you to break, nor do I want you to back up, but I want you to go forth and let's make a difference and bring this climate under control under God's anointing blessing.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Raj.